Hello RPA developers, my name is Bharat Juneja. In previous session, we saw how can we use WAP's API's configuration tool in Blue Prism. And in this session, we will use the WAP API configuration tool and create the definition of API. If you haven't watched our previous two videos, one is on JSON and another one is on WAP API part 1. So you should watch those videos before watching this one. For creating web API definitions in Blue Prism, we need the documentation of the API. The owner of that application or the developer of web API will provide you the documentation. In this session, I am going to use this free API. We can find all the documentation of this API here. Name of the API is Open Weather Map. We saw this in previous session. Means each definition can contains multiple actions and each one typically representing an endpoint within an API. So see, these are the endpoints of this API. There are 6 endpoints of this API. So these endpoints of an API are similar to the actions of an business object. Each endpoint have its own properties like header, parameter, URL. Let's see this endpoint get climate forecast for 30 days. Here is the description of this endpoint. As its name suggests, it will provide the climate forecast of next 30 days. Scroll down and we can see all other details like headers, parameter and all. We are going to use all the endpoints in our web API definition, and all these endpoints have similar parameter or similar header. So we will use that in our common header or common parameter. So let's create a web API definition. First we will do basic settings. For this we need the URL. So I'm using this REST C# code because our Blue Prism supports C#. Let's get started. Copy the name of the endpoint and click on this. We are doing basic settings, so let's paste the name. We should also paste the API name here, but I'm pasting this endpoint name. So get is the method. We will see it later. Now we have to enter the base URL, and the base URL is the consistent part of the URL like this www.google.com. Let's find the base URL of our API. In the code section you can see this URL. Let me copy the base URL. Paste the base URL here. You can enable or disable this web API definition by ticking this checkbox, and in advanced settings we can add the value of the HTTP request connection timeout. Here our basic settings are done. Now let's go to the API documentation and see the headers parameter. You can see a key and a host name here. With this help of key we will able to access the API, and in all the endpoints we can see this key is same, so we can use, and this key is the part of header parameter, so we can use a common header for all the endpoints because header, key and hostname are common in all the endpoints. We can copy it from the code section. Let's copy and go to the Blue Prism, and here in common headers we will paste the name of this key, which is xrapid API key, and the value is this one. Let's copy it and paste it here. Similarly we will do for the host. The name of the host is xrapid API host, and the value is community open weather map p.rapidapi.com. So this key is unique for every user. This is the access key of API. In common parameter, we can add common parameters which are common in one or more endpoint. So scroll down, and in this endpoint we have only optional parameter. So we can add it either in common parameter or in the action parameter. So we will create an action. We have to create separate action for each endpoint. So for this endpoint, get create forecast for 30 days. We are creating a action. This is the action and the method is get. In our API documentation, we can see this endpoint is based on get action. That's why its name is starting with get. And in parameter, we will add the optional parameter because this endpoint contains optional parameter only. In addition to optional parameters, an endpoint may have required parameters as well. See this current weather endpoint. Let's move back to the climate forecast for 30 days endpoint and copy the value of optional parameter and paste it here. If the parameter is common in two or more endpoints, then we can add this parameter in common parameters. Otherwise, we will add this in action. After inputting the name, we can add the description and initial value of the parameter, and also we can expose this to the processes, and we can select the data types. Now we will define the HTTP request that will made to this endpoint by selecting the required HTTP method and adding the URL, path, body, content and headers. This is the HTTP method of our endpoint. Our endpoint is using get HTTP method. You can see the details of each method on the screen. After method, we will define the URL path. This is the base URL which we already added. Now we need URL other than the base URL. In this we can see the optional parameter which is Q and its value San Francisco. Let's go to the API documentation and update the value. And see the updated URL in the code. It contains India. Let's copy this and paste this in the URL path. Now if we pass the value of Q as San Francisco, then it will always show the results for San Francisco, but we need the dynamic results. So we will pass the name of the city and we will make a parameter named as city. And these are the body content. This body content will configure the content to be sent with the HTTP request using one of the following content type. For get method, this will be none. Next one is header. These are action specific and we can add the name and value for each header specific to this action. But in this example, we are using a common header. So we are not adding any header here. First, let me update the value of the parameter as we use city in the URL path. So update the name of the parameter. Now when we will use this in our process, it will ask for a input named as city. There we will provide the value of the city and we will get the results for that particular city. Last one is response. To transform the HTTP response using JSON path or custom code to extract the required data, use response feature. In simple word, we can say responses are like outputs and parameters are like inputs. We will see the use of responses in next video. So we have created Web API definition. Now we can click on OK and it is ready to use in the process studio, means we can consume this web API. Let's go to the studio. Now take a action stage, because we have created the actions of a web API. So we will use the actions of that web API, as we have headings for the internal business object, utility objects, VBO. Similarly, we have a heading for web API services, and we can see our all web API definition under this heading, open weather map API. So we will consume this web API in next video. Thanks for watching this video, guys. Do comment your doubt and queries if any.